Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. Modern life is full of dilemmas and obstacles, and sometimes it seems like the more modern we become, the more complex the problems that we face. Computer passwords, for instance. Ugh. It's when you think about it historically, it's actually a medieval practice. You imagine these, for instance, soldiers and visitors in very old times coming up to the moat around a castle and being challenged by a guard. Who goes there? And you had to have the right password. Things really haven't changed. And our passwords are so complicated, and because of repeated security breaches and hackers, that now you almost have to have a password manager even to function. So, of course, that's what we do, right? Band-Aid solution. Instead of inquiring into why do people hack and what's happening with that, and maybe we should deal with the root of the problem. No, we just need more complicated passwords. So there's a password management company that some of you might use, LastPass. So after a security breach, they did a reset, and they did give people plenty of warning by email that they were going to do this, but it ended up bringing a problem of its own. So even people who were keeping up with their emails and they went through all the steps that were recommended still got locked out of their password vaults, meaning they couldn't access anything requiring a password. So many of them attempted to get help from LastPass, and they weren't able to access the help system. You want to guess why? Exactly, because you have to be logged on to access the system, and no one could log on, right? There's lots of that going around. I care for an elderly relative, not full time. She's my mother. I'm almost 90 years old, so I keep an eye on her. And I manage her finances, and I can't tell you the hoops I've had to jump through that are like that because of problems in the way all this is handled. It's just infuriating, and it takes enormous amounts of time. So one of our survival skills is developing the ability to shift all that, to change the game. And that's the theme of this podcast. When all else fails, change the game. Because one of the stark realities of the time we're living in is that you can play the game and obey all the rules and still end up nowhere. So years ago, I noticed that I had kind of a knack for disrupting the game, which is funny because I'm kind of a quiet introvert. I don't do rebellious things just to do rebellious things. I've never been that way. I'm not particularly oppositional, but even I have limits. And what I've learned about myself over the years is that when the limits don't make sense, I seem to have an ability to go around them. So this is a very minor example. I'll give you some more as we go. But when I was 18, I held down a job at an ice rink in the same town that I went to college in. And so I got a lot of really good handyman training in that ring, too. My manager was really good at that stuff. So a lot of benefits to the job. And one of the things it taught me was that sometimes you need to disrupt the game. So here's a kind of literal example. In the evenings, oftentimes hockey teams would come. And they would play, and sometimes they would come just for practice, but sometimes they had games. And so, fans, family, friends, everybody would show up and sit in the bleachers. So my job was to resurface the ice and prepare. So I'd get that big Zamboni going out in the middle and take care of that. And then after the game, I would resurface and I would clean up the rink, which is a pretty yucky job after a hockey game, and make sure everything was fine. And during the game, oftentimes there was no referee present. So part of my job was to make sure that inappropriate behavior didn't happen in the rink. Abusive behavior, verbally abusive behavior. So One time I was sweeping, and from the bleachers, I heard this one parent who was just swearing his head off, not only at his own kid who was out on the ice, but at parents on the opposing team. And he was really out of control. He was just screaming at people. So I went up into the bleachers and I said, you got to stop doing this. You need to control yourself. And he ignored me. And he kept right on doing it. So then I tried asking the people around him, can you please keep this guy under control? Which in retrospect was probably not a very good move. It certainly wasn't effective because they ignored me too. So I decided it was time to change the game. So while the teams were on the ice, I did something a little bit dangerous. I actually walked around I got out on the ice, walked around the edge. I went into the Zamboni pit and opened the gate, and I drove the Zamboni out into the middle of the ice. And of course, everybody was screaming and shouting, "You're interrupting the game," and all that, right? So I just sat on the Zamboni until everybody finally became quiet. And I pointed at the guy that I had talked to. And I said, as long as this guy is here, I'm staying right where I am. But you, sir, are being abusive, and you need to leave the rink. Otherwise, the game doesn't finish. And so they argued with me and yelled at me and all that. I didn't say a word in reply. I just sat there. And I had the power. They couldn't budge the Zamboni. They couldn't even drive the Zamboni. So eventually the guy left. And then I got off the ice and the game resumed. So as I said, that's a very minor example of changing the game. But the more practice I got, the more interested I became in how it was possible to do that and how it might be applied in different situations and what the strategies could be. It doesn't always work, and sometimes when I don't do it right, it just pisses people off. Here's a good example from even earlier in my life. So when I was in middle school, I was reading a lot of the Sherlock Holmes stories of Conan Doyle, and I learned two things from that. One is that I'm definitely not Sherlock Holmes, and the second is that it would be fun to practice his kind of deductive, as he called it, reasoning, observation and reasoning. So I decided to try this out on my dad. And it came into my head to do that one morning because right before he left for work, he was being really insulting and demeaning to us, which he often was. And so he left for work. It was a cold morning. He immediately came back a few minutes later because he had forgotten something, I think his briefcase. I was in the kitchen, and as he passed me, I noticed that the left side of his hair was blown up a little bit, like something had pushed it upward. And keep in mind that these were the days when, this is really far back, a lot of men of his age would slick their hair down in the morning. So something had dislodged it. So as he walked back to the car, I said, "Yeah, it's really a drag when your mirror gets knocked out of alignment like that." And he stopped dead in his tracks and turned around and asked me to repeat it, and I did. And he said, "How the hell did you know that?" I said, "Well, your hair, your hair is blown up on one side, and you're out driving on a cold morning." And so I tried to think of what might do that. The only thing I could think of was that you had your window down. And why would you do that unless you were adjusting the side view mirror? And he got really pissed off at me. Instead of, like I don't have kids, but I like to imagine that if one of my kids had done that, I would have been proud of him. But anyway, he got really scared, I think. "Don't you ever psychoanalyze me again. So I learned to be careful with that kind of thing. I also learned that one-upmanship is not really a good strategy. During that same period of my life, I also had a friend who was a really good chess player, and I knew how to play, but I've never been a great player, but I know the basics, and he always used to beat me. So what irritated me was he got really competitive about it and would kind of taunt me and which just takes all the fun out of it, right? Not so much the competitive part, but when people start making an issue of it and making fun of you, it starts to not feel good. So I decided to get the upper hand on him. So we played this one afternoon, I think 5 or 6 games in a row, and he won within a minute or two each time, which usually it took him a little longer to beat me. And I was smiling the whole time. And he's like, "Why are you smiling? It's just I'm just beating the hell out of you at chess." And I said, "Yeah, okay, keep doing it." And then finally it dawned on him that there was a reason for that, and he stopped. And he said, "You're rigging the game so that you lose each time, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I'm the one in control of this game, not you." Sometimes when we're facing difficult situations or obstacles or dilemmas, it's our stories about them, not just our attitudes, not just our logic, but our stories about them that block us and that limit our options. So when I work professionally, especially as a consultant, I refer to this as looking at our keystone stories. And those are the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and what our values are and the kind of work we do in the world and things that matter to us, things that help us navigate through life. That's what our keystone stories do for us. They make sense of things so we can move forward. And so part of what I do is I help people understand their keystone stories so that they can modify them when necessary or even try out new stories. One of the ways that you know that your keystone story is not useful anymore is when an obstacle comes up and you try to deal with it somehow and it creates unintended consequences. So there's one that's been talked about a lot in urban planning where I see this all the time in Southern California. There's a freeway that's jammed constantly, has been for years. And so somebody collects money to widen the freeway. So it works pretty good in the short term, at least maybe for a year or so. But what invariably happens is the developers get busy, a number of other people get busy. They create new housing, new buildings, new offices, new workplaces. And before you know it, the freeways are more crowded than ever because now more people can get through. Another example is let's say you're a farmer and maybe 5% of your crops are being eaten by an invasive pest. So you go down to the store and they sell you a bunch of chemicals. So you throw that on your crops. And for a couple of growing seasons, you get really good results. You've got 98 or 99% of your crop, let's say. But in some cases, what's actually going on is that you're weeding out through the chemicals the weak versions of the pest that was eating your crops, and the pest evolves. Now it's a super pest. And so eventually you're losing half your crop. Unexpected consequences. In California, there's a thing called sideshows where kids who are looking for adventure and some chaos at night take over intersections by driving their cars in circles really dangerously. So instead of figuring out why they're doing this and providing other outlets for it, the solution is to put more cops on the street. What does that do? It makes you look really cool if you sideshow even with all those cops out, because now you're doing something bold and dangerous and you're being kind of an outlaw. So it adds prestige. Unexpected consequences. So I decided to put together a little ebook. Well, maybe it's not that little. It's got 20 sections in it. Same title as this podcast. When all else fails, change the game. And what I did was collect the strategies that I've used myself over the years for game-changing moves, but also things I've noticed other people doing and I just gathered them up under different headings, and am now selling it online for people who, and I think we all go through this, when you're stuck, whether it's in your personal life or at work or something in the public happening or what have you, and you're not really sure what to do, and the usual methods fail. So then it's time to get innovative. That's what my book is for. And I've given lots and lots of examples. So I want to share a few that aren't in the book, and also talk about a few of other people's examples too. So, one of the ways that we can make it our game instead of somebody else's game is simply by operating on assumptions that other people don't have that nevertheless exert an influence. So, when I was a group counselor, I often saw men who had done jail or prison time for violent crimes. And then once they came out, they came to our counseling centers. And then they had a year with us, mandatory therapy. So we taught them not just anger management, but communication skills, relationship skills, stuff like that, how to regulate their emotions. So, especially when the guys were new, oftentimes they did that toxic masculine posturing stuff. So, there was a group that I was leading where we did a check in at the beginning, and the guys were all preening themselves on their fighting stories, how tough they were. Oh, one time I did this and they did, that kind of stuff, right? It's so boring and childish. So, my thought was that if I joined with them, or at least pretended to, I could lead the conversation in a different direction. Instead of straight up saying, let's talk about something else, wouldn't have been terribly effective. So I tried to do it with humor. So I waited for a pause and I said, you guys are reminding me that I have a martial arts background. And they went, you do? And I said, yeah, yeah. Haven't kept up with it that well, but I do. And there was a time actually when I thought I was going to be in real trouble. And then I had their attention. So I told them this story about I was in a bar and there were four Marines that were looking me up and down, and we went outside, and a couple of them pulled knives, and then I paused, and they all just stared at me. They said, "Well, what happened next?" And I said, "They killed me." And there was this 3-second pause, and then this big guy in the back of the room starts laughing. Right, he was the first to get it. And they were so mad. What? That's bullshit. And I said, "Yeah. If you're done posturing, now we have men's work to do. Let's move on." One of the roles I had in my family was the hero. The families assigned different people different roles: the hero, the outcast, the ambassador who makes peace, and all that stuff. So I got stuck with the hero for a while, and it got tiring, and I didn't like all those expectations, so I just stopped being the hero. I just changed my behavior. So when people would need to be saved, I would say, "Nope, you're on your own." And they pushed and pushed, but they finally realized it was just no good having me try to be a hero anymore, so they eventually gave up. And then I got to do other things that were more satisfying. There's a group called Incredible Edible that is breaking the food access rules and cost rules by giving people access to food in their front yards. There are people doing restorative justice because in places that the courts just aren't working anymore. Uber, Lyft, and Airbnb all started out as parallel institutions to replace things that weren't working well. So when you think about all this and you're in a dilemma, ask yourself, what are the rules that I'm obeying that I need to discard so that I can make this game my own? Thank you.